So this is episode 2 in our series, What School Can Be, and this one is called Learning to Do, Learning to Score. So the goal of the first episode was to explore how different motivations kids have toward their educations can really affect the outcomes of those educations. In episode 2, we will discuss how different understandings of what learning is can have huge effects on student outcomes. So schools are places of learning. So that's a really important word. We think we know what it means, but what does it really mean to learn? You would think that this topic would get a lot of discussion um, in schools with students, but there really isn't much discussion. Like I've really almost never had discussions about what learning is in my long career as an educator. I think there's a lot of assumptions within schools about what it is. But we are going to ask here, like, what would it be like to learn something? How would we know if someone had actually learned something? And so we're going to look at 3 different ways of understanding, evidence of learning. Well, the first is like, well, you got a good grade and your test scores are high. Your grades are high, your test scores are high. Obviously you must have learned something. I mean, the system must be set up such that the grades and test scores are accurate barometers of actual learning. Another way would be saying, look, you made it into a good prep school, and you went on to a good college, and maybe you went on to a good grad school, and maybe went on to got employment at a good firm. And if you've successfully navigated that system, well, that's evidence of learning, right? Like certainly the system must be set up to reward people who learn. Otherwise, like what kind of education system would it be? And then the third way would be like, what can you do better now that you couldn't have done before you studied? If you could do many things better now than before you studied, that means you've learned something. So we've got grades and test scores, we've got sort of navigating the system, and we've got improved ability to do. And there's going to be some overlap between those, but those are going to be the areas we look at here as we try to think this through. All right, so one of the key issues that's going to distinguish the kinds of learning is the kinds of memory that are involved uh, in different kinds of learning. And so we're going to need to study memory a bit here, and I think it'll be really helpful for us. So this wonderful diagram gives us a good comprehensive sense of the different kinds of memory and how they get created and stored. So it moves left to right. So from the left, we're bombarded with sensory information from the world, way more than we can process. The vast majority of it never registers. It just dies out. It's not stored in memory. And then we have working memory. Working memory lasts 10 to 30 seconds, not long, and it can be made to last longer. And so, as you see the guy there, the maestro, it's called the central executive. There's a lot of decisions that get made there, and you can just popcorn things in the working memory, and again, those aren't going to last very long. But the central executive can do more and send things further to the right. And the main ways to do that, you start incorporating what comes in through the senses into uh, greater coherences within the mind and experience. So one of the ways to do that is to send things to the phonological loop. So you're watching somebody speak, you're watching somebody give a lecture, and you find something interesting. And so you start going over it in your head, either consciously or pseudo-consciously, like, how would I say that? Or what exactly does that mean? And you start repeating it in your head in different ways. That would be working it through the phonological loop. And that starts putting it in a deeper kind of memory. You can also, really want to see it and see how things relate and look at the board and make sure you understand how things relate to each other. That's more of a visual sketch pad, and you're making connections that way, and you're embedding this. You're choosing to make this a feature of your mind in a more long term way. And for things to get really into the long term, they need to get into the episodic buffer, it's called. And that means you're taking all, memories that are already stored, and you're combining things you just recently learned with those and fitting them into almost like a drama, a sense of the unfolding of the world, a story where things fit. So you learn something about um, how computers work, and you know a lot about how computers work, and you see that something that you just learned might really fit with a new business idea. And so you're pulling on long-term memories, you're bringing in the new thing that you just learned, and you're trying to make them fit into a bigger story. Well, that's a great way to get something to be capable of living in your long-term memory so it can be drawn upon in the future. And so sensory memory, real fast, breaks down real fast. Most of it isn't even processed. Working memory, which is really important, but if it's only in the working memory, it doesn't last long. And then using the audio and the visual capabilities of the brain with the possibility of putting things in stories and drawing on previous memories, that then, as you go to the right, builds lasting memories that you can draw on to do stuff with.
So we're not going to go into all the gritty details about memory. There's neurons and dendrites and all these things we could talk about. That's not the focus of this. This is going to stay more at 20,000 feet, 20,000 important feet, but 20,000 feet. So whenever you form a memory from what you learn, there's a neural pathway. There's no knowledge or memory without neural pathways. The question is, how do you make those sticky? So there's a bunch of ways you can make them sticky. You can review the material. You can go over it again tomorrow. You can use different kinds of notes. Like you can listen to the lecture again. You can do a Quizlet. And so by repeating and by taking different angles on that knowledge, you can make little nubs on the neurons, and you can sort of add a lane to the highway of a neuron by repeated going back over and over several days. So you can add more lanes, and you can add nubs to make your memories have more traction, be more sticky, be more connectable to other things that you already know. And so, how do you do this? Well, one of the ways is to have really clear conceptual chunking when your memories come in. Like the clearer the chunking, the clearer the presentation as it enters your mind, the better it's going to stick in your memory. And then, as we talked about, spaced repetition of recalls, that also helps. You can again weave what you've learned into visual, audio, dramatic narratives. Like you work it more and more into your own language and into things that you've already learned. And then you connect to more and more areas of knowledge, right? Well, how does this thing in psychology relate to what you know about evolution, or to caring for your children, or a fight you had with your friend, or how does math relate to computer science, and these things? How do you make connections between major areas of what you already know? So if you look at the top here, that's sort of like a a good memory. It's got lots of nubs, it's got multiple arms. That's a healthy memory. And then if you go to the middle, that's the beginning of connecting what you learned to other areas of you learn. That's like the interdisciplinary connections where you're taking entire groups of what you know and connecting them so that they work together. At the bottom, now you've really got a coherent whole where different things you've learned are working together so that you can be effective in the world. And so different kinds of use of the brain that we'll go over here for the different kinds of knowledge. We're going to talk about the working memory juggle, we'll call it that. Then there's a kind that relies on what's called the hippocampus. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the verbiage. And then there's a kind of strong learning that gives you direct access to your other long-term memories that doesn't sort of need the mediation of the hippocampus. We're going to explain this here in a second. So the working memory juggle. So when a kid, a student at school, crams and crams and crams, their major way of learning is cramming. They cram right before assessments, and they take the assessments, and they get their grade, and then they dump it. This is the working memory juggle. And so when kids are all stressed out at school and they're bombarded with tests and quizzes and they feel overwhelmed, that's sort of the octopus on the right. There's too many things being crammed into the working memory that don't have a place in the deeper memory. Because if things are in the deeper memory, it's far less anxiety producing to work with them because they're there and retrievable. The anxiety of students you could see in the face of that octopus on the right, where it's just overwhelming to try to keep all this stuff in your head at the same time because they're not learning it in any sort of long-term way. They're not connecting it to other things. They're literally just trying to get that grade. And so because they're only trying to get the grade, they are packing their working memory and not using other parts of the memory. So we've talked about the goal and the strategy here. What are the pros of this? Well, in the short run, you don't really have to work very hard to establish deep long-term memories. And that seems like a good thing to a student, right? They've got other things to do, namely cram, cram, cram their working memory. So it seems like real learning is a huge pain and not worth the cost to them. The cons are, right, as you get older, over time, if you don't have long-term memory, you have to keep cramming and keep cramming and keep cramming because you keep forgetting everything. So you have to get it back in there. And this takes a lot of anxiety to keep those balls all up in the air, and it puts an emphasis on learning algorithms and shortcuts to remember stuff in the short run, to be able to solve academic problems without actually knowing anything or caring about the repercussions in the real world of how you would ever put such knowledge to use, because that again is complex and you need shortcuts because you're already overwhelmed. So then there's sort of this next step up in the rigor of the learning and the use of memory, and this would be the brain on the left. And so in this student's brain, there are longer term memories. This student doesn't study in a way with enough seriousness, enough variety, enough connection making to have direct access to those long-term memories, and they're not the strongest memories. But it's better than just the working memory juggle. And so if you look at that diagram on the left, there's a way to access those tentative long-term memories through the hippocampus. And this is a student who struggles to finish tests because this student knows stuff and knows it's there and has things available, but it's all mediated. So they're learning, they're struggling, they're trying to find it, they're trying to remember how I should be able to do this tougher problem, but I'm struggling. And it's better than the working memory juggle, but it's not ideal. And often it's what's in the long-term memory aren't real connections, but that's where the algorithms are, and that's where all the shortcuts are. And such a student builds a working memory not of real math concepts or scientific concepts or literary devices, and knows how to use them. It's just the shortcuts that will get you the grade that you need. And how do I get access to those in this stressful assessment situation? And so again, the pros, it puts kids in position to score well, right, on their assignments and assessments. Um, the cons are what happens when you don't see a type of problem that you've done before. What happens when you move beyond the realm of the similarity of textbook problems to real world problems? Is anything that you've learned going to help you with that solve real problems? And that's where relying on the hippocampus to get you access to your old successes in problem solving is going to break down. And that's where you want direct access to real connections in your long-term memory, and that would be the brain on the right. And so again, it's a different goal for such a person. This person's trying to understand the relationships between the academic material and the world, and is wondering, how would I apply this? How would I apply this? How could I do good for the world? How can I make a buck? How could I build a business? How can I leverage what I know to live better? And so the strategy is just very different. You start trying to make connections between things that are in your memory, both about types of textbook problems, but also the world's problems. The pros of this are that you actually build the ability to function in the world and draw upon what you learned to do. The cons are it just takes time, right? And if you've got a full slate of quizzes tomorrow, there's going to be a huge temptation, right, to juggle in the working memory or just rely on the mediated access to your ways of solving problems to get those grades that you need. And so you're not really going to take the time that you need to have direct access to your long-term memories to be able to do stuff like to try to have innovative pedagogy as a teacher to get kids to that level, or as a student to insist on finding it yourself through internships or clubs that might focus on real world problems. So we could ask, like, what's at stake? Like, why does this really matter? I mean, everything goes on as it does, and things are kind of fine. Um, so, like, what's the issue here? Well, kids are in school for an awfully long time, right? They start at like 5 years old or earlier, and they go on until they're 22 or at least. And that's a long time. And the costs of educating them are huge. And both for individual parents and also for society as a whole. Education takes up just vast resources, and then you add all of the student debt, right? Once you get into higher education, and it's overwhelming, right? So one would hope that what's happening is that people are being prepared to learn things that they then apply to the world. That if you never get kids to the point where they can take 20 or so years of their education and apply it to the world in helpful ways, then that's not really good for anyone, right? It's not good for the society as a whole, and it could have been much better for kids even if they game the system and they go to their elite prep school and they go to their elite college and their elite grad school and they end up, getting hired and making a lot of money. And so, uh, but what if they knew more? What if they could do more? What if they understood and could act on far more than they do? Um, and so there's a lot at stake, right? All that time, all that energy, all that money, all those social resources. What good is coming out at the other end? What have the kids learned? Uh, is it just that some kids have gotten A's and others B's and others C's and others have failed and fallen by the wayside, and that the schools have really sorted the kids in some way? Is that the primary function of schools, or have they actually learned how to do stuff? And if so, what stuff? And if like, how could they learn to do more? How could we tweak the system so that they actually know how to do things coming out at the other end, as opposed to just having gotten A's on tests and then forgotten things? And so that's what's at stake. So, what are some examples? Well, if you think about reading, writing, arithmetic, if a kid can't multiply and divide, add and subtract, if a kid can't write, sentences and ultimately paragraphs, if a kid can't read and understand what's going on, well, we would say that's completely unacceptable. We wouldn't say, well, oh, well, the kid got A's, so, I mean, the kid must have learned something, right? Like, it must have been valuable because the system works and the system is rational. And so even though the kid can't read, the kid got B's in reading, so the kid learned something about reading. We'd say, no, 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 the kid needs to read. The kid needs to multiply, right? And so, yeah, there's that. Like, that would be a great example where, hey, you got to do. Learning is about learning how to do. But just, again, out of the millions of examples we could use, take foreign language. Like, how many kids graduating from high school, even like good prep schools, are close to fluent in a foreign language, even though many of them have taken it for 4 years, 8 years, 12 years? Not many, right? So that's an area where we don't really demand the ability to do. It's like, well, I'm sure the system is rational. My kid got A's all through Spanish. It just, I thought it just wasn't, it was just too hard for my son to be fluent in it. But no, we know how to get kids fluent in languages. We don't care enough to do it, right? As a society, we just don't care enough. It's we could, but we don't. We accept A's as evidence of learning. We don't demand that somebody be willing to speak the language at the end. American history, kids study it for 3 years or 4 years, in some cases maybe 5 years through middle school and upper school. Well, what do they know if you were to ask the average graduate, either from a public school or from even an elite prep school, like, what's the meaning of American history? Or like, how has your understanding of American history helped you to be a better American? How do you apply like the meaning of American history to your way of being an American? I think these are questions, right, that virtually can't be more than 1 or 2% of graduates would be able to answer at all, right? It's like what ability to do is supposed to come from studying American history. It isn't clear, right? You just sort of, hey, I got A's in all my classes. I got A's on almost every test and quiz and paper. So I must have learned something, right? And this is the question of like, what does that learning mean? What was involved in that A? Was it at a minimal level just the popcorn of working memory? Did that kid master the shortcuts for getting A's on tests in history class? There are some, right? And sort of had access through the hippocampus to all of those shortcuts and pulled out her A's? Or did that person really make connections and has this rich understanding of how studying American history in school plays out as being an American in the world and how those are related and how that learning could actually help you be a better American, what that would mean? Like, wow, like who, like it, that's possible. Like it happens. It doesn't seem to be the goal though, right? Like the foreign language where, hey, I got the A's, I must have learned something. I mean, the system's rational. So we just don't demand that we get to the ability to use what we learned and connect it with other things we learned. That's just kind of maybe a distant hope. Mathematics, and the kids so learn the shortcuts to solve relatively complex mathematical problems. And they have those in their memory and they get at them through the hippocampus. And some kids go do internships and some kids do math club and have aggressive math teams where they're actually learning real world applications. But you just take like algebra 2 and pre-calculus. Like you're studying all these different kinds of functions, right? You've got linear functions and quadratic functions and cubics and sine and cosine trig functions and all these other kinds of functions, right? Well, the goal of all that is that, like, hey, the world behaves in ways that can be modeled by these functions. The world behaves in linear ways, and there's quadratic relationships in the world, and there's sinusoidal relationships in the world. And you're learning how to manipulate those. Like you're learning the different ways the world works and how to model those ways using math. That's why you're studying all these functions, right? Well, that's really what's behind like algebra 2 and pre-calculus. That's the great benefit. You could take a data set, you could say, okay, there's a data set from the world. Which of the many function models best fits this data, and then how could I use that function and put this data into such a function that would allow me to make predictions, say. Well, there's very few people who study math who realize that that's even like what algebra 2 and pre-calculus could or should be, that you should end the class being able to do that. And there are some modeling problems, but they tend to be very basic, they're very contrived, and they're very shortcuttable and algorithmic in the ability to just learn that specific kind of textbook problem and get an A on it. And so you have these kids who have almost no understanding of how the math would ever get applied. And so they're just, learning the stuff to get the grades. They don't know how to apply it. Some kids do, but a pretty small minority. And we're okay. I mean, my kids got grades and the tests were hard. And so, hey, they learned, right? So college admissions and how does it play a role in all this? Well, if you think of how hard a job they have, like all these applicants, it already takes a lot of resources of the college to like deal with all those applicants. Well, how are you going to know what a kid knows? It's really hard, right? So you invent the SAT-2s, like the subject matter tests, but of course they give those right at the end of the school year, and that's when all the kids are encouraged to take it. Literally, we tell before you forget everything, right? Before you forget everything, you need to take the subject matter test. Well, at that point, the subject matter knowledge test doesn't really function as a real subject matter knowledge test, right? And so how does a college know what a kid knows? It's so hard to see. in terms of being able to use what they've learned, well, they could look for internships and they do value those and everything, but in general, they go by grades, right? They go by grades. They sort of punt on trying to figure out what a kid knows, and they go by what they can measure: how smart a kid is, how hard they work, how aggressive their schedule is, how much they take on, right? But how much do they know? Wow, that's really hard for a college to ascertain. And because that's hard for a college to ascertain, it doesn't play that big a role in the process. Because it doesn't play a role in the process, it doesn't really get emphasized in the process of learning. Because if it's not valued or really even intelligible by the college admissions process, why waste your time on it if college admissions is your chief goal in going to school? And so the college admissions process is a serious player in all of this. And we will get to that in the next episode, actually. And so, how are children learning? That is what we want you to think about. Like, how are your kids learning when they get their A's? Like, what's behind that? And as a teacher, like, your kids have A's. What can they do with what they learned? So they have A's, they're at the top of their class, but what does that mean? And are they going to forget almost all of that? And is there a way to structure their education so they don't forget almost all of that and they can put it to use and do put it to use? That's where we'll go from here.